Reactive Training Systems.
So
I had to bike home so I could get my animal crackers.
that's where we'll start. You see right there. Jim can lead us off. Biking home real quick.
I shouldn't have waited to join. I was eating my rice cakes before. I should have eaten them.
Well, usually I've got a pizza here. So just throwing that out there. You know, usually there's a pizza here and I'm eating it. And Paulie's making fun of me, possibly Mark Robb, because he spends a lot of time doing both of those things. But instead, they're not here, so here we are. Jim's eating animal crackers. I'm not eating pizza because I already ate pizza today.
Drinking LaCroix. La Croix, if you're French.
So I ate a pizza. Adam's drinking water, and Jim's eating animal crackers. So what are you doing there, Rory?
I have flavored water.
Flavored
Nice.
water? Well, hey, that's cool enough to be in this group, you know?
I ate popcorn today.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, maybe we could put that on the list of like why people should listen to, right? So Rory's here we're talking about long-term injuries today. You should listen to Rory because she stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Just kidding, obviously. So what is some of your background, Rory? Why should people listen?
Why should people listen to me? Well, because I wear glasses and I have long hair. No. So I'm a physical therapist. I have my doctorate in physical therapy, and after I graduated physical therapy school, I became pretty engrossed in powerlifting and got my starting strength certification. So I coach people, a lot of powerlifters in person, and I take, as far as rehab goes, I take a barbell approach to rehabilitation. The stronger you are, the stronger you fight injuries. So that's me,
Well,
in a nutshell, I guess.
And I can vouch for the process, at least to the extent that I'm currently going through it, and maybe we'll talk more about my situation a little bit later, but a barbell approach to rehab.
Someone stole barbell rehab already, so.
Yeah.
And there's barbell rehab.
But just as a concept, though, like it's an interesting concept. So obviously, you're a competitive powerlifter. You're not too shabby at that, right? And you are obviously really immersed in the injury rehab world as well. So, I mean, I would imagine that gives you kind of a different perspective on both of those things. You know, on both the rehab and the training side.
Well, I think so. I can give you a little bit more information. I didn't really answer the question very well before. My background, actually, like growing up, I was a dancer. So I've always just loved human movement. And that's how I ended up going into physical therapy. And then in physical therapy school, I was introduced to barbell training. And then barbell training just made the most sense to me as far as human movement. If you look at the barbell lifts, a squat, a deadlift, an overhead press, and a bench press, like, actually resemble all of the movements we do on a regular basis in our lives. So there, you know, you see so many people talking about functional training and functional exercises, but when you come down to the simplest aspect of function, a squat, a deadlift, an overhead press, and a bench press, and chin-ups and pull-ups, lat pull-downs, all that kind of stuff, are essentially the most functional exercises and the best way to functionally train. So that's how I implement the barbell into rehab for any athlete or any person. You know, if you have like a 90-year-old who is rehabilitating from a hip fracture, she has to get up off her chair, she has to get up off the toilet, and that's a squat, you know, or she has to get down and up from both. So that's why I utilize the barbell lifts. They make the most sense with respect to function.
So, I mean, it kind of distills it down to, I guess, the most basic variation.
Yep.
And then the idea is that from there, I guess, in terms of whatever other movements that people go through, that's as general as it gets.
Yes.
You know, so if you train these general patterns, that should have transference, that should have carryover.
Yep.
So,
and I mean,
yeah.
from a physical therapy standpoint, obviously not everybody's going to be able to put a barbell on their back day one. So there's ways to break it down for like the 6-year-old to the 90-year-old and everybody in between. So there's 900 different ways to accomplish the same thing, but using the principles of barbell training.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I've got a question for you. So I'm assuming you mostly see athletes. Do you see any non-athletes in your practice?
Oh, for sure. Well, actually, so as of around this time last year, I left private practice. So I left general outpatient orthopedic practice and opened my own, like, I don't really have the right term for it yet. It's going to eventually be an outpatient orthopedic practice. But right now I'm just like one person renting space in a gym, seeing clients. And they come to me mostly for physical therapy, some for barbell training, and some just for personal training. So right now I don't have, I would say 95% of my clientele is either regular gym bro or power lifter. But then, you know, I just had someone come in to me. She had a foot fracture in November, and she's had so much weakness. She's continued to have pain for a very long time, and she was referred to me by a person who's coming to me for barbell training. So, you know, I don't shy away from from the general population, but at this time, my practice isn't set up for the general population. It's set up more for powerlifters and barbell athletes. But in the past, I've worked with everything from hip replacements to ACL reconstruction to developmental delays in young children, everything like that. So
it seems like we end up spending quite a bit of time on this podcast talking about injuries and stuff like that. You know, that's why you're here, actually, because it seems like a lot of us end up dinged up, and it's pretty easy for that stuff to kind of snowball and keep going for a pretty long period of time. And Rory, I know just talking to you over time, you kind of have some thoughts and views on why that might be and what people need to do to, you know, avoid that situation. So if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm sure that all three of you and anybody listening to this who's a lifter has been told by someone or a group of people or their doctor, don't lift weight, you're going to hurt your back, you're going to hurt your knees, or lifting heavy weight is just bad for you. But you can say that about anything. So you could, like, I worked in a situation where the practice owner was a runner, and she just said, that's so bad for your knees, why would you ever squat that much weight? I'm like, well, here you are at 45 years old getting Synvisc injections into your knees because you run triathlons, you know? So any sport that you do, you're putting yourself at risk for injury. The thing to say is not, don't do that, it's bad for your knees, but why don't you learn the best way to do that so you can avoid injury as best as possible? And working with athletes throughout the past couple of years who are powerlifters, the biggest things that I see as far as accumulating injuries over time are technique. So a lot of people, you might be a really strong lifter, but if you have a terrible bar path or you're not executing a lift with, like, consciously executing a lift and thinking about everything that you're doing, and you have a bunch of cues lined up, or your balance is off, or you might not be using the right footwear, or you have very tight shoulders, so your bar doesn't sit in the right spot. The bar deviating from the middle of your foot or deviating from midline of your body is going to produce a tremendous amount of injuries over time. It might not come into play when you're lifting very light loads, but as the loads get heavier, or you have high frequency of performing the lifts, or your volume is very high, over time, injuries are going to come out because of that.
So just to kind of distill that down, you would say that it's mostly focused on technical aspects of the lift.
Yeah, technical aspects of the lift. So, like I said, you can have someone who is a world-class athlete And so I'm sure you've heard like, well, so-and-so squats like this and he's the best in the world, so I should squat like that too. Well, and this is how people kind of come up with their technique, or this is how they're going to squat because someone does it this way, but that's not always the best way for everyone. You know, a lot of the times these top level lifters actually have like the worst form. They just have great genetics, so they can overcome a lot of physical laws and just lift a tremendous amount of load. But if you're just Joe Schmo trying to get really strong or do really well in powerlifting and you're executing like a genetic freak who doesn't think about anything, he just puts the bar on his back and squats, then you might end up hurting yourself.
So do you do much in the way of individualizing that technique?
So actually what I do is I have a model, like a biomechanical model of how a lift should be performed based on how the joints move, different laws of physics, and then I apply that model to each lifter individually. So everyone's going to have different anthropometry. Someone might have a very long torso, someone might have very short upper arm or a long femur or small feet relative to the size of their body, you know?
Small feet?
I don't know, a very small, let me tell you, I'm very short, but I have big feet and it's a very wide base of support. So you might have someone, that's your feet are your base of support, you know?
Hey,
I've seen weird things.
I just never thought of it like that. I mean, it makes sense, but I never thought of that.
If you are a bigger person, but you have small feet, your base of support relative to the size of your body is very different, very small. So
yeah, stands the reason. Well, and I mean, also if you think about it as well, we've all seen people who maybe have a really wide sumo deadlift stance and they point their toes almost parallel with the barbell, so really, really toes out. And it creates balance issues, like front to back balance issues.
Oh, absolutely.
So, I mean, I guess it could be a similar thing, hopefully less exaggerated, but yeah. Okay. Anyway, sorry, it derailed us with the small feet.
You know, your A to P, so your anterior posterior length of the foot. You know, when you turn the toe out in the sumo deadlift, you've shortened that distance from front to back. So,
yeah.
But also, you know, even just bringing up sumo stance, that's a common thing that I've come across in lifters that I've worked with is there is this whole idea that wider is better with sumo. Like we're going wide, go as wide as you can. But that's not true. So who's telling you to go wide? A person who potentially has a very wide stance is potentially a very tall person or someone who has very long legs. So I've come across people who say, well, their coach tells them to go like toes to the bar and then bring their heels in. I'm like, but your coach is 5'8" and you're 5'2", so that doesn't make sense for you. What this person is trying to accomplish is find the maximum width that their stance is efficient at. So, and when I assess, so going back to, do I apply the same ideas to a person? Yes, I apply the same principles, but not the same, like, and not everybody's going to look the same. So when I'm looking at someone, when I'm trying to find someone's sumo stance, I'm looking for about a 90-degree bend at their, give or take 10 degrees. So it really depends on their anthropometry, but give or take 10 degrees at the knee in more flexion or more extension. That's how I determine their stance width. So when their hands are on the bar and they're getting set, I'm looking for that 90-degree bend at the knee. And that's where the quad is going to be most efficient to produce force off the floor. Any wider and you get less quad involvement and you get too much stretch on the adductors. So I have principles that I apply to the individual, and rather than just saying everybody should do this. Does that make sense?
I mean, and that's the essence of individualizing, auto-regulating stuff anyway. Jim, I think I've cut you off like 8 times.
Yeah, no, it's cool. One of the questions I had is somewhat related to me, but I assume a lot of people have the same issue. Perhaps a lot of people that you have experience with, you know, hip pain and hip issues. Mm-hmm. So for me, I tend to take a lot of time to make sure my feet, like you talked about, the basic support, are as even as possible. The issue is that I've been lifting, you know, 4 or 5 years, and so not a lot compared to some other people. You know, but if one foot is where I'm always uneven, right? Mm-hmm. That's where I think it's even, but doing it for so long. But then I also talk to other people, and they say things like it doesn't need to be perfect. But it's like, for me, if it's not feeling perfect, then I notice that pain. So the question is, how do you approach lifters who have like a lot of unevenness that feels even for them, and why is it, do you think, that an unevenness is what's causing the pain?
So that's actually a really good question, and it's very common. So we have to take these asymmetries in the context of pain and no pain. So if we sliced our face down the center, both sides don't look equal. You know, one eye might be bigger than the other, one might be a little more slanted, we might have a bigger cheek. You know, we're just not even. We're not asymmetrical. We're not symmetrical, even though we look symmetrical. We're not necessarily symmetrical. So a lot of the times, you know, I like to observe a lot of people in the gym, even if they don't have any pain. That's what I do. I observe. So you know, you'll always see someone whose toe is turned out a little bit more. They might set their squat up with their foot a little further back than the other one. But if there's no pain, then that might be what's normal for them. Okay, so if it ain't broke, we don't fix it. Okay, but then when you have someone coming who says, I chronically have SI joint pain, we have to look at the individual as a whole. So the way that I would approach an evaluation, whether it be a Skype evaluation or an in-person evaluation, is always a posture assessment first. We want to kind of look from head to toe. Where are their shoulders sitting? Do they have asymmetries throughout their spine, throughout the muscles around their spine? Is one hip higher than the other? And then we move into, and we look at the knees, the hips, the feet, everything. We assess leg length, and then we look at range of motion of the spine, the hips, the knees, everything. But we look at active range of motion and passive range of motion. We look at muscle length, muscle tightnesses, which is not something you can necessarily do in a Skype evaluation, but there are ways to look at tightness and range of motion across the screen, but it's always better in person. Now, I mean, specifically for you, what have you tried?
So I've been doing some weird things. I think I posted a picture on Facebook a while back of me squatting, and I actually drew a chalk line around my feet where I thought was even. And I had like 5 people tell me, like, look, you're either uneven or you're even. Because I really can't tell. Like, I'm looking straight down on my feet. Mm-hmm. But what happens is I'll either rotate my torso.
Right, so then you look even. Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, I'm even. And I'm like, no, dude, your foot's like 4 inches in front. So I had 3 or 4 people just double check, okay, this is where my feet need to be. And I have good gym friends, so I had one of them take a chalk thing and just draw it around my feet while I had a loaded barbell. And then I just try to get in that position, and that actually did a lot of wonders for me, really. And,
so wait, you had them with your feet even relative to them, or relative to
it's more like, okay, find a straight line, on the floor or something, and I try to be able to replicate that evenness. Because, if I have a chalk mark, it's just that's where I need my feet to be, and then I change my hip position, and usually that means my entire body, torso, and hips are aligned with my feet versus, I'm turned here and it looks like I am.
Right. Now, did this help you?
Yeah.
Evening out your feet helped you?
Yeah, a lot, because I had probably, I don't know if you can really tell here, but I had like a 2-inch difference in, because I played basketball, and whenever, like, that was my motor pattern for a while. It was like my right foot's supposed to be in front of the left. So that's a natural setup.
As far as, looking at whether or not it's the unevenness that's causing the person's pain, or the unevenness is coming because of something that they're doing. So it's kind of like, what's the chicken or the egg? So a lot of what I do is trial and error, because everybody is so individualized and things develop. Maybe it's because, everything develops in its own process, and we kind of play around. Someone might have a leg length discrepancy, so maybe I'll play around with putting something under their foot while they squat, but that might make it feel worse, and so then I'll take that out and I'll say, okay, why don't we turn your toes out, or just move this foot one, and figure that out. But it's not always necessarily about the stance. Sometimes that can be like, maybe you have a hip tightness, one hip is tighter than the other. So sometimes we take the whole assessment and say, well, why don't you also work on your hip mobility while we work on adjusting your stance? And then usually something will click, and the pain will go away. So
right, and that's a lot of what I do on my own, as well as just figure out, make sure I want to be even. So that way it's like, okay.
So you were having SI joint pain though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I still do, but I'm able. Don't want to get too specific about myself, but I've been dealing with it, and what I have noticed though is just as long as I have someone watching me throughout the lift, like I basically make them be my own personal, therapist or whatever. Just tell me what I'm doing. Am I shifting down to the right? Am my hips coming up? Like, tell me what I'm doing. I can consciously control that if I'm aware.
Absolutely, and that's something that I really highly recommend on a regular basis. Like, even though I'm a coach and I'm a high-level power lifter, I still, every time I train with my husband or one of my gym friends, we're all coaches. So I say, can you just watch me do this? Do you see anything? Because even if we're great lifters, we also tend to, if we don't have verbal feedback or visual feedback of ourselves, then we tend to kind of develop bad habits. So that foot position might have developed out of a bad habit, like you didn't even realize you were doing it, and then over time it caused the hip pain. So then it felt normal to you because you've always stood like that for the last 6 months, but it was causing hip pain. So we need to get feedback from our environment, whether it's us taking videos of ourselves from different angles, or it's getting a coach to take a look at us periodically. So even though, that's why I don't recommend that everybody train alone always, because if you have like a garage gym, I say periodically go train with friends so that they can say like, dude, what are you doing? That looks weird. That's not right. And for even myself, I've had injuries too. And my first injury as a lifter was was diagnosed with it after I had my injury, but I have femoral acetabular impingement and a labrum tear in my hip. And I was aggravating all of that because I was doing like good morning squats. So I was shooting my hips back and then my knees were sliding forward. They weren't coordinated. So we spent like 6 months making sure I was coordinating myself. So I basically did some neuromuscular reeducation, coordination training, all with the squat, verbal cues, visual cues, tactile cues to make sure that I was executing it correctly. And then eventually I didn't need anybody around me. I was like squatting alone without doing that. But then over time, the bad habits came back. So then I, always make sure that I train with someone periodically to make sure I'm not falling into weird habits. So I encourage all lifters to take videos of themselves just to say like, oh, that looks bad or that looks good. Like, let me make sure all my sets feel like that because that set was a good set, So
getting on the videoing, are there any particular angles you prefer for diagnosis?
Yeah, so for the squat, I like a back angle, so a directly behind and directly to the side, and like a back oblique. So there's 3 angles that I like for that. For bench press, I like from the side and from the front or front oblique. Deadlift directly from the side and from a front oblique. And overhead press, because did I say bench already? Yeah, I did. I use overhead press in my for all my clients on a regular basis. It's always in their program. I use a back angle and a side angle. So I think that's all 4 lifts. Yeah. So, and then if there's anything that I see, and I haven't been able to attack from those different angles with those lifts, then I'll say, can you try taking it from this angle and see what happens?
So you mentioned your own hip issues and stuff like that. So just kind of going back to the technique part and how you apply these principles to individualized technique. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that worked for you? So like you started out with this good morning squat and then you find out that you've got this hip issue. So how did your own technique evolve from that?
Well, the good morning squat was a technique flaw. So actually what I was doing was, instead of all my joints unlocking at the same time and staying balanced over the midfoot, I was doing this good morning squat. So I was having my hips go back before my knees unlocked. So the bar was coming forward of the midfoot, and then I would have this counteracting knee slide forward to get my bar back over the midfoot. But then I was sliding so far forward that I was jamming up on the front of my hips, and that's where I was getting the pain. So I was getting pain right in the bottom, and then as I came out of the hole. So then what I focused on was unlocking all of my joints at the same time and staying balanced over the midfoot in order to fix that. And then initially I think we used pause squats and tempo squats to work on timing, so coordinating the joints at the same time. And then the pause squat was to kind of reinforce the bottom position so that I wasn't sliding forward and shifting to the forward of my foot. So that's pretty much how we did it.
I find those to be super useful, especially, if you have somebody that's learning a new technique or, kind of relearning the correct technique, anything like that. I like to start with the tempo work. And, I mean, you'd be amazed that, well, I guess you wouldn't be amazed, but people in general are often amazed at how much more you feel if you just slow the movement down. And a 3-second eccentric and a 3-second concentric is actually pretty darn slow. So it gives you plenty of time to feel what all those positions are like. And then once you get to the point where you've developed enough proficiency with this 303 tempo work, I like to do the 2-second pause stuff because it's the same sort of thing. You're developing that kinesthetic awareness of what the bottom position feels like, what it's supposed to feel like when you're doing everything right. So over time, you've developed this movement proficiency so you can go bang right to those positions every time.
Yep.
I think that stuff is really underrated technical work.
Absolutely. And then I've seen a lot of injuries with it's such a sad injury to see happen, but since we're talking about tempo, I just wanted to bring this up because when I've seen the quad tendons tear in competitions, it's either that the person trains too high, which is like another conversation, and they go lower than they do in training, and then their quad tears, or they have such a quick descent and it speeds up right at the bottom that it's such a quick stretch on the tendon, and that's where their tendon's snapping. So speed is really important in order to maintain control and to maintain appropriate tension on your muscles. So if you have a quick stretch under load, that can tear a muscle that's unprepared for that. And particularly as as the load gets heavier and heavier and heavier in competition, that quick stretch under load is on a third lift is going to be heavier than that tendon has ever handled before. So you want to actually make sure that your squat is the tempo is consistent, whether it's a 1-2, a 1-1, a 2-2, or a 3-3. You want your 1-1 to be consistent. You don't want it to be like 1. You want.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? You don't want to just
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We always teach people.
A second down, 1 up.
Yeah. I always teach people quick but in control. You want to have a quick descent, but if you're departing controlled movement, then, you're not going to hit the right position anyway. So, that's not a good plan. And now you're saying.
So you're saying
predisposing yourself to injury risk and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're saying speed is not the crucial part of powerlifting? Is that what we're saying?
Well, yeah, and as also, if you go too quickly into the hole, you periodically bottom out. If the load is heavy enough, you're going to just totally collapse and lose control. There are people that can overcome that, genetic freaks. There's always...
You see all kinds of problems with that, though. This isn't about sitting here armchair quarterback and anybody saying, oh, imagine how much better they would be if X, Y, and Z. It's not about that. It's about saying, look, if you have a person who's, just dive bombing the thing, and then they get to the bottom, and their whole body squishes while they, try to turn this weight around in the hole. That's not an ideal situation. There's so many problems with that.
Well, yeah, and so think about your spine squishing under, your spine squishes, your quad squish, everything squishes, and squishing's not good under 550 pounds. So
you don't have injury problems that come from it. You have lots of problems just completing the lift or generating force to overcome the load on your back.
Right, and I think that a lot of people don't understand the stretch reflex. So a lot of people are like, oh, bounce off your calves, this ass to grass squat that people like, just bounce off your calves. Well, that's not really what it is. It's tension on your hamstrings, and you get a quick stretch at the bottom of the squat. If you go too far, you've gone past that. And if you're too high, you won't get that. So you have to find the optimal bottom position, but you need to approach it with tension. So if you just drop into the bottom of a squat, you're never going to find that. There's not enough tension there anyway. So I don't know. Some people just drop.
With the stretch reflex, would you find that if people have a lot of butt wink, and so they kind of just curve under, would you say that kind of kills the stretch reflex?
Yes and no. So, well, yeah. So yes and no. So you'll see a lot of people, especially larger males, typically have two things. One, they can't get to depth without enough load on their back. And two, there's a ton of butt wink before the bar is actually loaded with enough weight to kind of even out that butt wink and put enough tension in their system that they can't butt wink. So yeah, when you butt wink, you slacken the hamstring. So if the hamstring's not tight or tight enough, then there's not going to be a stretch reflex in the hole. So then you typically see the bounce off the calf with that one. So you see the butt wink with squats that are too low, or guys that don't have enough weight on the bar.
You're also doing some pretty serious loaded spinal flexion at that point.
Well, yes. So I mean, if you're a 275-pound man with 135 pounds on your back and you got butt wink, that's not going to cause a tremendous amount of lumbar stress. But if you continued to do that with 600, 700 pounds on your back, then that would be a problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
What about in the opposite direction and say, talk about positioning and making sure we're performing the movement properly? A lot of people try to counter that butt wink with a lot of actually anterior pelvic tilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is going to be some degree of anterior pelvic tilt as you descend into a squat because you're flexing your hip. You're flexing at the hip. But yes, there are people who hyperextend their low back. The hyperextension of the low back doesn't typically happen in the bottom of the squat, though. It typically happens as they initiate the squat. So when they're breaking at the hips and the knees, they overextend their low back. And in the squat, that's where you can irritate the low back. You can get what's called, so you're irritating the facet joints when you do that. And you can end up with mechanical facet joint pain over time. And if you do that too much, and depending on how strong your bones are or what size you are, typically in the smaller female lifter, you'll see that turn into over time a spondylolisthesis, which is little fractures in the in the vertebrae. So
I wanted to switch gears real quick. We're talking about injuries, but so I'm looking at the start roster for Raw Nationals coming up here, and I've got you seated 4th going into Raw Nationals. How's your training going, and how are you? Yeah, you.
Oh, me. I was like,
yeah.
I'm like paying attention to it. How's my training going? I don't want to tell.
No, you do, because I might write an article about you.
Okay, well, my training is going really well. But don't tell me. Right now I'm in like a restoration phase, just like a tens on squats. That doesn't feel good. I don't know. It's just going well.
It seems like a lot of people are doing 10s on squats this week. I posted on the Team RTS group this morning. I got like a hate text from a friend of mine in Austria.
That was my last week. Was 10s. It was awful.
Yeah. He sends me this picture of himself like laying on the ground.
I should have sent you a picture of my blue lips.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of people are doing that this week. I think Ross Lapella either this week or last week. No, it was this week because he sent me an email telling me about his 10s on the deadlift and just some.
I've got that
some
after
weird
this.
happenings. Yeah. Well, anybody who's like I don't know, confused about life or anything, I would highly recommend 10s on the deadlift. Like, don't eat anything all day, and then do 10s on the deadlift until you have a vision. I'll clear that up for you.
Oh, God. Help me.
Just kidding. Don't actually do that. Just throw that out there. But anyway, I had another topic, I guess, to bring up. related to you being both a high-level lifter and maybe somebody who's a bit, hopefully training a bit smarter than the average person.
I try.
Yeah, so a lot of people think of, there's just kind of, I don't know how to frame this. I guess there's a mentality about being willing to work through pain in order to get to high achievement. What are your thoughts on training with pain? Like, how much is too much?
How much is too much? Well, your body is really good at telling you that that something is not a good idea to do. So if everything is hurting, or not if everything is hurting, just go home. If you're warming up and the pain seems to be getting worse, or it doesn't go away, and it lingers after a set for a period of time, it's not a really good idea to train that particular movement for that day. Anytime it gets worse is an indicator that you should definitely stop for the day. But if it gets worse to the point where you're like, we use what's called a visual analog scale, VAS. So it's on a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being totally normal, no pain, everything's good. And 10 being like, go to the emergency room right now. And I'll tell you, 75% of patients in general orthopedic practice come in and say, my pain is a 10. I'm like, okay, well, I'm calling 911 right now. So that's what 10 is. 10 is like, go to the hospital. And I typically say that if pain does not increase higher than a level 4, it's okay to train. But if it at all makes you uncomfortable, like mentally, like if you feel like this isn't really good, I shouldn't continue to do this, then just stop. It's not worth it. At the end of the day, it's not worth it to have pain when you're training. I train through more than 4 because I know what I'm feeling. I have a really good understanding of the human body and human movement and injuries. So if it's like just pure muscular and I know that I'm not hurting myself more, then I'll just keep going. But I wouldn't necessarily say that to a client. And at the end of the day, if you continually have pain over many weeks, that's like a low level amount of pain, that should be checked out. Because something that's not going away over time, orthopedic injuries heal. But if it's not getting any better, then it needs to be evaluated. So stop what you're doing and get it evaluated.
Okay. I'm a bit surprised, actually. I thought you would have a more conservative stance than that.
Well, I think that's pretty conservative. I mean, if your back is killing you, okay, let's just talk about back injuries for a second. So if you're having, so back injuries are a little different. Our spine, our whole nervous system's encased in our spine. So anytime that there's an injury to the spine, we take it a little bit more seriously. Now, if you have symptoms that radiate beyond your low back, so if you feel symptoms, like you might have been feeling symptoms in your back when you first started warming up, and then all of a sudden you have shooting pain down your leg into your foot's numb, you feel burning, you feel tingling, that's really bad. Shut it down and see how you feel tomorrow and talk to a doctor. So if you have low back pain, I would say shut it down if you start to feel things kind of creep up over 3 or 4.
I do like the notion of kind of monitoring and seeing if it's getting better or worse.
Yeah.
You know, if it's a thing that's getting worse, then obviously we'll shut that down.
Yeah.
And making a distinction too, like my elbows are a little bit sore because I'm doing all this volume of bench and something like that versus I'll use myself as an example. Yesterday I was doing my incline benches. I had a new bench that was maybe a little bit weird. I did my first 3 sets, everything's fine. Do my 4th set and it's fine, but when I get up, it's like, man, my neck is stiff all of a sudden. Like I think I may have strained my trap here now.
Yeah.
All right, we'll probably knock it off for today.
Yeah, absolutely. And
there's nothing to be gained from rolling this again.
That happened to me the other day when I was doing 8s on bench. 8s. It was 8s. I started getting like a stiff neck, that kind of neck where you're like, oh, can't turn my head, I have to like turn everything with me. So I said to myself, and this is just me because like I know how to manage all this stuff. But if that was a client, I would have been like, it's not worth it. Like, you already did 3 sets, just go home. Like, 3 sets is enough. Me, I was like, oh, I'll do my last set and I'll go see my chiropractor. But that's me. Like, I know what's going on. But if you don't know what's going on, then I would just say it's not worth it. If you've already put in enough work for the day and you develop something during a set or at the end of your training day, just like shut it down. So.
Well, for what it's worth, I would have told you to shut it down as well.
Glad I didn't tell you.
Right.
I was complaining enough. I think I had already complained about my lips turning blue, so I... Oh, wait, I don't know if this was
funny
last
how
week.
I know what response I'm going to get, so I'm going to manage my inputs here so I can get the response that I want. I think that happens a lot more than any of us would care to admit.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys want to wrap up, but I have one question about low back pain.
Sure.
Or just back pain in general. So I've done a bit of research in pain science. Obviously, I'm no expert, but what I have researched is that most of us have some sort of spinal degeneration past when we turn 25 or whatever. It's very common to see that if you go to get an MRI of your back or your pain.
Right.
However, say that there is really this, and that is the cause of pain. Is it even worth it, in your opinion, to get an MRI? The treatment, like surgery, seems not to be very effective for back injuries, right? What's your thoughts on that thing?
So we actually just went through this with Mike. Now, at the end of the day, bearing no real significant cauda equina type syndrome, which is when you have such a bad herniation that the lower portion of your spinal cord is getting compressed and you've lost bowel and bladder function. Barring nothing like that, we're not going to jump to surgery. So there's typically more conservative options that doctors and physical therapists will take before they put someone into surgery. Now, so if there's if you have symptoms that are coming from your back or seem to be back related issues, you can't just prescribe an MRI for yourself. So you first have to go to the doctor and say or the physical therapist or chiropractor, and then they'll say, okay, well, based on my evaluation, this is the course of action we'll take first. The doctor won't necessarily first prescribe an MRI. MRIs cost a lot of money. So it's not necessarily, right. So the treatment might not be different depending on if it's a facet syndrome or a herniated disc. So we might treat you the same way, so an MRI would not necessarily give us more information than we needed at this time to make medical decisions going forward, to make treatment decisions going forward. After conservative treatments, if conservative treatments don't work, or your symptoms are such that they're red flags and they want to send you for an MRI right away because they need to know really what's going on, then they might send you for an MRI. In the case of Mike, I had suspicions that his body was responding a particular way. He didn't have much pain, but his body was responding a particular way to the squat and the deadlift. And it was my suspicion that it was doing that because there was a herniated disc or something going on in his back. So we said, I think that you need to see the doctor so we can confirm this and then make our treatment recommendations based on that.
So a lot of it is eliminating the worst case, right?
Right. So yeah, basically what we do is rule things out. We don't typically don't rule things in. We just want to rule everything out. So once we've ruled out or taken multiple steps and then we can't really figure out what's going on or you're not responding to treatment, then we say, okay, let's look at an MRI and see what's going on.
I've been talking about dealing with hip pain and stuff like that for, a long time, like 2.5 years. So what it ended up, when Rory and I started working together, I guess back in May, long story short, we ended up finding out that it's not really a hip issue, it's more of a back injury, more back issue. What I've been doing to work around that in the meantime, I've been doing high bar squats because I can do that without pain. I think I've more or less found a method of deadlifting that doesn't produce any pain. That's been kind of a long time coming. But now I'm back to training, not particularly strong yet, but that'll come. I'm just glad to be lifting weights and not like cutting sessions because it hurts and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So,
and also, I mean, so MRIs, and so when it comes to low back pain or pain that's referred pain into the leg, or numbness or weakness or whatnot, it's not always an MRI that you necessarily need. They usually do an MRI with everything, but they also do like nerve conduction tests and EMG studies to diagnose more specifically if it's a peripheral nerve entrapment or if it's coming from the back. So you might have an MRI that says you have a herniated disc, and then everybody goes, oh, he has a herniated disc and that's what's causing the problem. But that might not be it. They then can do further tests to say, okay, well, they do nerve conduction tests or an EMG to say, here's actually where the nerve is being compressed. It's not at the spinal level, it's at the hip level, or it's under this muscle, you know? So just because you have a positive MRI doesn't mean that your symptoms are coming from your back. Which I guess goes back to the question that you asked, or what you said before, Jim, was that if you took 100 people between the ages of 25 and 50, or 25 and 30, 80-90% of them would have herniated discs, but could all be asymptomatic, you know? So we just have to kind of, based on presentation and based on imaging, we then come up with a plan. So it's not necessarily just the image, it's the image and the presentation together.
well, and just kind of in hindsight, in my case, in particular, we did end up getting an MRI, but at least from my perspective, I don't really feel like it changed anything. We were doing things already. We'd already found ways to kind of work around the issue. We got the MRI and noted some things, but also noted that, okay, there's nothing major or unexpected with this, so we continue doing things that aren't
right. So the reason, so there were from my end, there was a couple of reasons why we wanted to get the MRI. One, we wanted to confirm it because I can't physically evaluate you. I needed a better idea of what was actually going on, so the MRI confirmed it from afar what might be going on. And second, there was the idea that maybe if there was this very local, because you weren't responding to NSAIDs, so you weren't responding to anti-inflammatories. Your pain was always the same regardless of whether you treated it with anti-inflammatories or not. So the idea was that perhaps we could treat it more locally with an epidural if there was something really going on there, and then that would eliminate the pain completely. And even the doctor discussed the epidural with you, that we could do it, but wouldn't necessarily be the end all, or it wouldn't necessarily be the best approach. And thirdly, you're going to hate that I say this, but I think that it gave you a little bit more ease of mind, because I think that your training improved once we got the results from the MRI, that like your spine's okay and you can train a little bit better. So there's multiple aspects to treating a person as a whole, and I think that there was just a little bit of a psychosomatic component with the not that you were presenting with pain because you didn't know what was going on, but I think that it eased your mind a little bit to be able to train through pain a little bit better.
You're right.
So.
No, I'm kidding.
Well, my dentist told me my jaw pain's in my head yesterday, so I was like, "You're an asshole." No, it's not.
Find a new dentist, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm calling and saying I don't want to see that one. I'll see the other one from now on.
Right. Well, the biggest thing to me was to understand the process, to understand, one, what was most likely going on, two, what we were doing in the short term, and three, and probably this was the biggest thing to me in terms of my peace of mind, was understanding how this is going to play out, or how we expect it to play out, at least over the weeks, months, and years to come. You know, having that vision to the future is really important to me, and now I know that there's a lot of individual difference there, but that gave me a lot of peace of mind, just knowing what to expect in the future, probably as much as anything else.
Right, and interestingly, something that we talked about this with when we had the discussion about always training with your belt on, is when someone has an injury, particularly to their spine. Okay, from a physical therapist standpoint, from a coaching standpoint and the combination standpoint of being a physical therapist and a coach together, we want to always treat our lifts like we have an injured back. Whether or not we have pain or symptoms at any given time, we always want to protect our spine. And the reason we want to do this is, like I said before, our entire nervous system comes out of our spine. So as we know, and like Jim said before, there's just generalized degeneration in our spines as we age. All of that stuff accumulates over time, and we're loading our spine every training session that we have. So we are causing more degeneration to happen over time, which happens anyway, but it's going to happen in training. But we just want to protect our spine as much as possible, because if we have, and I think I mentioned it to you, I call them whispering discs. Is that what did I tell you about that? Right? You know, if we have these whispering discs that are asymptomatic, that we don't know about, because we're not just going to run around and MRI everybody's back before they do pull a deadlift or go a squat. At any point when we have a deviation of the bar from midline with 600 pounds on the bar, at any given point, if our spine doesn't stay stable enough, we can blow a disc or blow our back out or completely herniate a disc and compress a nerve. So as strong as we are and as symptom-free as we are after an injury, we still should always treat our back like it's injured and protect our spine. So that's how I approach. That's why I always put a belt on. And lift like I've had pretty bad back injuries too. One that was 2000, right after nationals in 2014. And then I had another one going into and coming out of nationals 2015 that lingered for a very long time. And actually just now in the past like 2 or 3 months, I'm pretty much symptom free in my low back. And I mean, I still train through it, but I train very smart. I will not ever pull a deadlift with a round back, ever. And if you go back before 2014 and you look at my videos of my deadlifts, I was reckless. Even though I'm a physical therapist and a starting strength coach, and I know that my back should not be round, when I got to heavy lows, when I got to competition, when I got to near competition, I just let my back go in order to pull weight off the floor. But at the end of the day, I ended up battling a back injury for 2 years. So it's not like I just run around and say, put your belt on and don't pull with a round back. It's for real. You don't want to screw with your spine. So otherwise you're going to be paralyzed one day. So.
All right. Well, I've already taken more time than I should have, but really appreciate you and sharing your thoughts with us.
Of course, anytime.
Yeah. Hopefully we have more of you around.
Hopefully.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Jen, for being here. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you.
Reactive Training Systems.